She laughed at his old pickup truck. By midnight, that same truck would become the one thing she could not stop thinking about. The town of Cedar Ridge sat between rolling hills and long stretches of Colorado highway where everybody seemed to know everybody else. It was the kind of place where people still held doors open for strangers and waved from passing trucks. Most visitors drove through without slowing down. Victoria Hayes was not planning to stay any longer than necessary. At 37, she was the chief executive officer of one of the fastest-growing real estate development companies in the region. Her calendar was booked weeks in advance. Her meetings happened in glass towers, not small-town diners. Yet that Tuesday morning, business had brought her to Cedar Ridge for a land acquisition meeting involving several hundred acres on the outskirts of town. The deal was important. The timeline was tight. Victoria preferred efficiency over conversation, and she certainly did not expect anything memorable from the trip. The meeting took place inside a renovated community center overlooking Main Street. Luxury SUVs and executive sedans filled the parking lot. Local officials mingled with investors. Coffee steamed from paper cups. The atmosphere felt polished and professional. Then an old pickup truck rolled slowly into the lot. The truck was at least 20 years old. Its dark blue paint had faded under countless summers. Small scratches marked the doors. The front bumper showed signs of hard use. It was clean, but there was no hiding its age. Several executives glanced toward it and immediately looked away. Victoria noticed it too. The driver's door opened, and Ethan Walker stepped out. He wore worn work boots, a plaid shirt, and a brown jacket that had clearly seen many winters. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing about him suggested influence. He simply looked like a hard-working local resident arriving for another ordinary day. Victoria watched him approach the entrance while carrying a folder beneath one arm. One investor standing beside her chuckled softly. "That truck belongs in a museum." Victoria smiled. "Or a scrapyard." A few people laughed. The comment was brief, casual, forgotten almost immediately by everyone except the man who happened to hear it. Ethan paused for the smallest moment as he walked past them. Not long enough to create a scene. Not long enough to make anyone uncomfortable. Just long enough to confirm that he had heard every word. Then he kept walking. No argument. No angry expression. No attempt to defend himself. He simply opened the door and disappeared inside. Something about that quiet response felt unusual. Most people either reacted or pretended not to care. Ethan did neither. He carried himself with a calm dignity that seemed strangely unaffected by what others thought. Victoria barely noticed. She had already moved on to discussing projections and construction schedules. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Throughout the presentation, Ethan remained seated near the back of the room. He rarely spoke. When he did, people listened. Local officials greeted him warmly. Business owners nodded respectfully when he shared observations. Even the mayor seemed interested in his opinions. Victoria found it mildly surprising. He did not look like someone who commanded attention. Yet somehow he had earned it. During a break, she stepped outside to answer a phone call. The afternoon sun hung low above the mountains. A cool breeze moved through the trees. Across the parking lot, Ethan stood beside his pickup while speaking with a young girl around 11 years old. She had bright eyes and a backpack slung over one shoulder. Victoria watched as Ethan handed her a sandwich wrapped in paper. The girl smiled and hugged him before climbing into the truck. The simple moment lasted only seconds. Yet it revealed something no business report ever could. Later, as Victoria returned to the meeting, dark clouds began gathering along the distant horizon. Most people ignored them. Summer storms were common in the mountains. But Ethan glanced toward the sky and frowned. The wind felt different now. Colder. Heavier. The kind of change that locals noticed before weather reports ever caught up. While investors discussed profits and timelines inside the building, the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. By the time the meeting ended, most of the investors were already thinking about airports, hotel reservations, and the next item on their schedules. Ethan Walker was thinking about getting home before the weather turned worse. The difference said a lot about the two worlds sharing the same room. Outside, the sky had changed. Thick gray clouds rolled over the mountains like a slow-moving wall. The sunlight that had filled Cedar Ridge earlier was fading beneath a blanket of shadow. The air carried the sharp scent of approaching rain. Local residents noticed immediately. Visitors did not. Victoria Hayes stepped out of the community center while speaking into a wireless headset. Another deal waited for her in Denver the following morning. Several calls remained on her schedule before sunset. She moved quickly through the parking lot, focused on numbers, contracts, and timelines. Nearby, Ethan loaded a few boxes into the bed of his old pickup. His daughter Lily sat inside the passenger seat finishing homework. The truck itself seemed almost out of place among the polished luxury vehicles surrounding it. Yet despite its age, everything about it was carefully maintained. Ethan checked the tires, secured the cargo, looked toward the horizon again. Another distant rumble echoed through the hills. Lily noticed the concern in his eyes. "Storm?" she asked through the open window. Ethan nodded slowly. "Bigger than they predicted." She glanced toward the darkening sky. "Should we head home?" "Soon." Across the lot, Victoria finally ended her call and headed toward her SUV. As she passed Ethan's pickup, her eyes landed on the faded paint once more. Something about the truck amused her. Perhaps it was the contrast between their lives. Perhaps it was simple habit. She had spent years surrounded by luxury, efficiency, and success. Old things often looked like problems waiting to happen. She paused near the vehicle and shook her head with a small smile. "I still cannot believe that truck made it here." One executive laughed. "It probably needs a tow truck standing by." Another joined in. "Or a miracle." The comments floated through the air. Lighthearted, harmless to some ears, not entirely harmless to others. Ethan heard every word while securing the last box. Lily heard them too. For a moment, the little girl looked down at her notebook. Children often understood embarrassment more deeply than adults realized. Ethan walked around the truck and opened the driver's door. His expression remained calm. He did not defend the truck. He did not defend himself. Instead, he looked toward Lily and smiled. "Ready?" She nodded. The engine started immediately. Strong, steady, familiar. As the pickup rolled out of the parking lot, Victoria watched it disappear onto the county road. Something about Ethan's reaction felt unusual. Most people either argued or tried to impress. He had done neither. The observation lingered briefly before another phone call demanded her attention. Within minutes, she forgot about him entirely. Ethan, however, did not forget. Not because he felt angry. Life had taught him long ago that people often judged what they did not understand. After losing his wife 8 years earlier, he learned to save his energy for things that mattered. Raising Lily mattered. Keeping food on the table mattered. Being present mattered. Opinions from strangers did not. Still, as he drove along the winding road toward home, he glanced at his daughter. "You okay?" Lily looked out the window. "Why do rich people always think old things are bad?" Ethan smiled softly. "Not all rich people think that." She did. He could not argue with that. Rain began tapping lightly against the windshield. Ethan turned on the wipers. Sometimes people only see what is on the outside. Lily considered that quietly. And sometimes they miss everything important. Ethan glanced at her and laughed. "You are getting wise." The pickup continued through the hills as rain steadily increased. Meanwhile, Victoria's SUV headed in the opposite direction toward the interstate. Her driver estimated 3 hours back to Denver. Under normal conditions, the trip would be easy. But as darkness slowly approached, weather alerts began appearing on phones across the region. Wind warnings, flash flood advisories, severe thunderstorm watches. Local residents adjusted plans immediately. Gas stations filled. Store owners closed early. Farmers secured equipment. Yet inside the comfort of her vehicle, Victoria barely noticed the growing concern. She trusted schedules more than storms. Outside, the first heavy drops of rain struck the pavement, and somewhere beyond the mountains, the approaching night was bringing far more than anyone expected. The storm warnings became impossible to ignore by early evening. Weather alerts flashed across highway signs. Local radio stations interrupted programming with updates every 15 minutes. Wind gusts were strengthening. Heavy rainfall was moving faster than expected. Most residents of Cedar Ridge had already settled in at home by the time darkness began covering the valley. Ethan Walker stood on the front porch of his farmhouse watching the sky. The clouds looked different now. Lower, heavier, almost alive as they rolled across the mountains. Lily stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "It looks bad." Ethan accepted one of the mugs and nodded. "It is going to be a long night." The old pickup sat parked near the barn. Rain already glistened across its faded blue paint. To most people, It was simply an aging truck. To Ethan, it represented years of persistence. Countless early mornings, school drop-offs, grocery runs, emergency trips, memories. It had carried his family through some of the hardest chapters of their lives. He trusted it the way some people trusted old friends. Several hundred miles of driving experience had taught him one thing: reliability rarely came from appearances. Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes sat comfortably in the back seat of her luxury SUV as it moved north along a winding stretch of highway. The interior remained warm and quiet despite the growing storm outside. Her driver maintained a steady speed, while windshield wipers swept back and forth. Victoria reviewed emails on a tablet screen illuminated by soft interior lighting. Another acquisition proposal awaited approval. A conference call had already been scheduled for the next morning. Her life moved according to calendars, deadlines, and expectations. Weather felt like an inconvenience rather than a threat. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the mountains. Several seconds later, thunder followed. The driver glanced toward the dark horizon. Storm is getting stronger. Victoria barely looked up. How much longer? About 2 hours if conditions stay the same. Conditions did not stay the same. 20 minutes later, rain intensified dramatically. Visibility shrank. Wind pushed against the vehicle. Traffic slowed across the highway. Headlights reflected off sheets of water racing across the pavement. The comfortable confidence that had filled the SUV earlier began fading beneath growing uncertainty. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan finished securing equipment around the property. Lily watched from the kitchen window while helping prepare dinner. The house smelled of soup and fresh bread. Warm light spilled from every room. Despite the storm outside, everything felt safe. Yet Ethan remained uneasy. Years spent living in the mountains had sharpened his instincts. Something about this weather system bothered him. It was moving too quickly. Around 7:30, his phone buzzed with another emergency alert. Severe storm warning. Travel discouraged. Ethan read the message twice before placing the phone back into his pocket. Across the highway, Victoria's SUV entered a remote section of road cutting through rolling hills and dense pine forest. There were fewer vehicles now, fewer lights, fewer signs of civilization. Rain hammered the roof. Wind rocked the vehicle unexpectedly. Even Victoria finally stopped working and looked outside. Darkness swallowed most of the landscape. Maybe we should have stayed in town, the driver muttered. Victoria frowned. Can we still make it? Before he could answer, another flash of lightning exploded across the sky. For a brief moment, the entire road appeared bright as daylight. Then darkness returned. The driver tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Silence filled the cabin. Not comfortable silence. The kind that appears when people begin calculating risks they had ignored earlier. Back at home, Ethan checked the weather radar one final time before dinner. The image caused his expression to tighten immediately. The strongest section of the storm was moving directly across the highway corridor leading out of Cedar Ridge. He stared at the screen longer than necessary. Something told him people were still out there. Travelers, visitors, drivers who did not understand how quickly mountain weather could change. Outside, rain pounded the windows harder than ever. Wind rattled the old farmhouse. And somewhere far beyond the darkness, headlights continued moving through a storm that was no longer behaving like an ordinary storm at all. The storm crossed from threatening to dangerous in less than 30 minutes. Rain no longer fell in steady lines. It crashed sideways against vehicles, trees, and buildings with relentless force. Wind howled through the mountain passes. Branches bent and swayed beneath sudden gusts. The roads leading away from Cedar Ridge grew darker with every passing mile. Inside the SUV, Victoria Hayes finally closed her tablet. Business reports no longer mattered. Visibility had dropped so dramatically that even the bright headlights seemed swallowed by the storm. The driver leaned forward, peering through the windshield. Water streamed across the glass faster than the wipers could clear it. "I do not like this," he said quietly. Victoria glanced outside. For the first time that day, uncertainty touched her expression. How much farther? Still more than an hour. A flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead. The momentary brightness revealed standing water collecting near the shoulder. Then darkness returned. The driver reduced speed again. Several vehicles had already pulled off the highway. Others continued moving cautiously through the storm. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan Walker stood near the living room window, watching the weather worsen. The television carried emergency updates from across the region. Road closures were beginning. Low-lying areas were flooding. Several sections of highway had become difficult to navigate. Lily sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. "You keep checking the weather every 5 minutes." Ethan smiled faintly. "Probably. Every 3. She laughed softly. The sound brought warmth into a house surrounded by wind and rain. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that someone out there needed help. Years of living in the mountains had taught him to trust instincts that rarely came with explanations. Sometimes the weather itself seemed to whisper warnings long before trouble arrived. His phone buzzed again. Another emergency alert. Travel strongly discouraged. Ethan read it carefully before slipping the phone into his pocket. Meanwhile, the storm continued tightening around the highway. Victoria's SUV rounded a sharp curve where dense pine forest crowded both sides of the road. The driver suddenly frowned. "That is not good." Victoria followed his gaze. Water was flowing across part of the pavement ahead. Not enough to stop traffic entirely. Enough to make every driver cautious. The SUV slowed further. Thunder rolled across the hills. Lightning flashed again. The road seemed increasingly isolated. Cell service bars on Victoria's phone dropped from 3 to 1, then disappeared completely. She stared at the screen. No signal. No emails. No calls. No messages. For someone accustomed to being connected every moment of every day, the silence felt strangely unsettling. "We will regain service soon," the driver said. Victoria nodded. Yet something inside her knew he was guessing. Several miles farther ahead, another problem waited. A fallen tree had partially blocked one lane. Traffic crawled around it. Rain continued hammering the roadway. Drivers grew tense. Visibility worsened. The entire journey felt slower with every passing minute. At home, Ethan finally made a decision. He grabbed his jacket and keys from a hook beside the door. Lily immediately looked up. "Where are you going?" Ethan hesitated. "Just checking a few roads nearby." "In this weather?" He knelt beside her and smiled reassuringly. "I know these roads better than anyone." Lily knew that expression. It was the one her father wore whenever he had already made up his mind. She hugged him tightly. "Be careful. Always." Minutes later, the old pickup truck pulled away from the farmhouse and disappeared into the storm. Its headlights cut through the darkness like two small beams of determination. Ethan drove slowly, scanning roads, intersections, and low-lying areas where trouble often appeared first. The truck rattled gently over familiar pavement. The weather was fierce, but the vehicle handled it with steady confidence. Across the county, Victoria's situation continued deteriorating. The SUV hit a section of flooded roadway harder than expected. Water splashed across the hood. The driver tightened his grip on the wheel. Warning lights flickered briefly across the dashboard before disappearing. Both occupants noticed. Neither spoke. Rain drummed against the roof. Thunder echoed through the valley. Then, several minutes later, a different warning light appeared. This one did not disappear. The driver stared at it silently. Victoria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Outside, the storm showed no signs of slowing. Inside the vehicle, for the first time all evening, the possibility of being stranded no longer felt distant. The warning light stayed on. That was what frightened Victoria Hayes most. Not the thunder, not the darkness, not even the rain hammering the SUV from every direction. It was the quiet certainty on the driver's face as he stared at the dashboard. People who drove for a living learned to hide panic. The fact that he looked worried told her everything she needed to know. "What does it mean?" she asked. The driver kept his eyes on the road. "I am not sure yet." Victoria disliked that answer. She had built an entire career around certainty, around solving problems quickly and moving forward. Yet tonight, the storm seemed determined to ignore every skill that had made her successful. Another blast of wind struck the vehicle. The SUV drifted slightly before the driver corrected course. Rain continued flooding sections of the highway. Traffic had almost disappeared now. The few vehicles still moving looked isolated and vulnerable beneath the endless darkness. Several miles away, Ethan Walker guided his pickup through the storm with patient concentration. He knew every curve of these roads, every low area, every section where water collected after heavy rain. His headlights swept across soaked pavement and swaying trees. The old truck rattled gently, but never hesitated. Ethan had spent years maintaining it himself. Every bolt, every hose, every repair. He trusted it completely. The radio crackled with emergency updates. More road closures. More warnings. More stranded motorists being reported across the county. Ethan listened carefully. Something about the situation bothered him more with each passing minute. Back inside the SUV, Victoria tried calling for assistance again. No signal. She checked a second device. Nothing. The digital world that usually surrounded her had vanished completely. For the first time in years, she felt truly disconnected. The realization left her strangely uneasy. "Can we turn around?" she asked. The driver looked ahead through sheets of rain. Not safely. Victoria stared out the side window. The darkness beyond the glass felt enormous. She remembered laughing at the old pickup earlier that day. The memory surfaced unexpectedly. She pushed it away. It seemed irrelevant. Yet somehow it lingered. The SUV rounded another curve. Then everything happened very quickly. A loud splash echoed beneath the vehicle as they crossed deeper water than expected. The engine stumbled briefly, recovered, then stumbled again. Warning lights multiplied across the dashboard. The driver muttered something under his breath. The vehicle lost speed. Regained it. Lost it again. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. What is happening? The answer came several seconds later when the engine finally fell silent. Momentum carried the SUV toward the shoulder before it rolled to a stop. Rain pounded the roof. Wind shook the vehicle. The dashboard glowed with warning indicators. But the engine did not restart. Not once. The driver tried again. Nothing. He tried a third time. Silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The reality settled slowly. They were stranded, in the middle of a mountain storm, with no phone service, miles from town. Victoria stared through the windshield as rain distorted the world beyond the glass. Her expensive vehicle suddenly felt very small, very vulnerable. The confidence she carried into every boardroom offered no protection here. Outside, nature did not care about titles or achievements. Back at the farmhouse, Lily sat near the living room window waiting for her father to return. The storm made the old house creak softly. She glanced toward the clock. Ethan had been gone longer than expected. Meanwhile, Ethan continued driving through increasingly difficult conditions. Near a small intersection, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through standing water before disappearing toward the highway. Most people would not have noticed them. Ethan did. He slowed the truck and studied the marks illuminated by his headlights. Recent, heavy vehicle, moving fast. Something about them caught his attention. He followed the road farther than originally planned. Wind buffeted the pickup. Rain blurred the windshield. Yet the uneasy feeling inside him only grew stronger. Several minutes later, through the darkness and storm, he spotted something faint in the distance. A pair of hazard lights flashing weakly near the shoulder of the road. Ethan immediately eased off the accelerator. The orange lights blinked again through the rain. Then again. Alone. Motionless. Waiting. The old pickup continued forward while thunder rolled across the mountains, and somewhere ahead, a woman who had spent her life believing she was always in control was beginning to understand what it felt like to have none at all. The flashing hazard lights grew brighter as Ethan Walker guided his pickup through the rain. Water sprayed beneath the tires. Wind pushed against the truck from the side. Yet the old vehicle continued forward with the steady confidence of something that had survived many difficult nights before. Ethan slowed as he approached the stranded SUV. Even through the storm, he recognized it immediately. The sleek design. The luxury badge. The same vehicle parked outside the community center earlier that day. He pulled onto the shoulder several yards ahead and switched on his own hazard lights. For a moment, he simply sat behind the wheel, watching rain race across the windshield. Then he reached for his jacket and stepped outside. The storm hit him instantly. Cold rain. Powerful. Wind. Darkness broken only by headlights and lightning. He made his way toward the SUV and knocked on the driver's side window. Inside, Victoria Hayes looked up in surprise. The driver lowered the glass slightly. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked. The driver nodded with obvious relief. Engine died. No signal. No traffic. Ethan glanced toward the dashboard, then toward the flooded roadway behind them. "You have been here long." "About 20 minutes. Another gust of wind shook both vehicles. Rain blew through the partially open window. Ethan looked at Victoria for the first time since the meeting. Recognition appeared instantly in her eyes. Neither mentioned it. Not yet. Some moments felt too awkward for words. "I can take a look," Ethan said. The driver opened the hood while Ethan inspected the engine compartment beneath a flashlight beam. Water dripped from every surface. Wind tugged at his jacket. After several minutes, he closed the hood again. His expression told the story before he spoke. "It is not getting fixed tonight." The driver exhaled heavily. Victoria stared through the rain toward the empty highway. "What are our options?" Ethan looked around at the darkness surrounding them. Pine trees swayed violently beyond the shoulder. Water continued rising in nearby ditches. The storm showed no sign of weakening. "Honestly," he said, "the safest option is getting off this road." Victoria folded her arms. "And how exactly do we do that?" Ethan pointed toward his truck. The same truck she had laughed at only hours earlier. The faded blue pickup sat beneath sheets of rain with its headlights cutting through the darkness. Reliable. Familiar. Waiting. Victoria followed his gaze. For a brief moment, embarrassment flickered across her face. It disappeared quickly, replaced by practicality. Circumstances have a way of changing priorities. Another blast of thunder rolled across the mountains. The driver looked toward Victoria. "He is right." Silence settled between them. Not hostile silence. The uncomfortable kind that appears when pride collides with reality. Finally, Victoria nodded. "All right." Ethan simply said, "Grab what you need." 10 minutes later, the SUV was locked and secured. The driver chose to remain with the vehicle, hoping roadside assistance might eventually reach the area. Ethan respected the decision, though he clearly disagreed. Conditions were worsening by the minute. Victoria climbed into the passenger seat of the pickup. The door closed with a solid mechanical sound. Suddenly, the storm felt farther away. Not gone, just muted. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and years of honest work. A small photograph rested near the dashboard. Lily smiling beneath summer sunshine. The interior was clean but simple. No luxury finishes. No expensive screens. Just practical things serving practical purposes. Ethan adjusted the heater and pulled back onto the road. For several minutes, neither spoke. Rain drummed against the roof. Wind buffeted the truck. Headlights illuminated swirling curtains of water ahead. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "You did not have to stop." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Somebody needed help. Even after earlier, he knew exactly what she meant. The comments. The laughter. The assumptions. Ethan shrugged. Storms do not care about any of that. Victoria looked out the side window. The answer lingered in the air long after the words were spoken. Outside, the weather continued raging across the mountains. Inside the aging pickup, something far more important had quietly begun. Not friendship. Not trust. Not yet. Just the first small crack in a judgment both of them were starting to see differently. The old pickup pushed steadily through the storm while rain hammered the windshield in endless waves. Ethan Walker kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Years of driving mountain roads had taught him patience. Storms rewarded calm people and punished careless ones. Beside him, Victoria Hayes sat quietly, watching water race across the glass. For the first time in a very long time, nobody was asking her for decisions. Nobody was waiting for instructions. Nobody cared that she was a chief executive officer. Out here, she was simply another person trying to get through the night. The realization felt strangely uncomfortable. Another flash of lightning illuminated the valley. For a brief moment, distant hills appeared in sharp detail before darkness swallowed them again. The pickup continued forward. The heater filled the cabin with welcome warmth. Victoria rubbed her hands together. She had not realized how cold she had become sitting inside the disabled SUV. Ethan noticed without mentioning it. A few minutes later, he reached behind the seat and handed her a folded blanket. "Keep it." Victoria looked surprised. "You carry blankets in your truck?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Colorado." She almost laughed. The simple answer made perfect sense. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and stared out the window again. The silence between them felt different now. Less awkward. Less defensive. Somewhere along the highway, judgment had started giving way to curiosity. Eventually, her eyes landed on the photograph near the dashboard. The same smiling girl she had seen earlier in the parking lot. "Your daughter?" Ethan nodded. "Lily. She seems happy." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "She keeps me busy." Victoria studied the photograph. "How old is she?" 11. The answer opened a door neither of them expected. Slowly, The conversation began unfolding. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just two people sharing pieces of themselves while the storm raged beyond the windows. Victoria learned that Ethan had spent most of his life in Cedar Ridge, that he ran a small repair business, that he coached youth baseball during summers, that he rarely took vacations because being present for Lily mattered more than traveling. Ethan learned far less about Victoria because she answered questions carefully, yet even she found herself speaking more honestly than usual. She talked about long workdays, endless meetings, expectations that never seemed to end, success that looked impressive from the outside but often felt lonely from within. The pickup rolled through darkness while thunder echoed across the mountains. For a while, neither noticed how much time had passed. Then Victoria glanced toward the fuel gauge and frowned. Where exactly are we going? Ethan checked the road ahead. There is an old Ranger station about 15 miles from here. Solid building. Backup generator. Safer than staying on the highway. Victoria nodded. Trusting someone she barely knew felt unusual. Yet she found herself doing exactly that. Perhaps because Ethan never tried to impress her. He never mentioned her position. Never reminded her of earlier comments. Never made her feel guilty. His quiet dignity accomplished something far more powerful. It left her confronting her own assumptions without being forced. Another gust of wind shook the truck. Branches swayed overhead. Rain continued pouring from the sky. The storm showed no interest in ending anytime soon. Victoria looked down at the worn dashboard, the faded steering wheel, the carefully maintained controls. The truck she had mocked earlier now felt remarkably dependable. The irony was impossible to ignore. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. Ethan glanced at her, but remained focused on the road. For what? She almost smiled at the question. Both of them knew exactly what she meant. The truck. The comments. Earlier today, Ethan was quiet for several seconds. The headlights illuminated another stretch of rain-soaked pavement. Finally he spoke. "People make judgments. It happens. That does not make it right." Ethan nodded once. "No, it does not." The conversation ended there. Not because either person lacked words. Because sometimes the most honest moments require silence afterward. Outside, the storm continued testing everything in its path. Inside the aging pickup, something else was being tested. Assumptions, pride, perspective. And as the distant outline of the ranger station finally began appearing through the rain, Victoria found herself wondering how many other things she had overlooked simply because she had only looked at the surface. The ranger station emerged from the storm like a lighthouse hidden among the trees. Its weathered wooden walls stood firm against the wind, and a faint glow from emergency lights spilled through the windows. Ethan Walker guided the pickup into the gravel lot and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither he nor Victoria Hayes moved. Rain continued drumming against the roof. Wind rattled nearby branches. Yet after hours on the road, the sight of shelter felt almost unreal. "We made it," Victoria said quietly. Ethan nodded. "For tonight." They hurried through the rain and stepped inside. The building was simple but warm. A backup generator hummed somewhere in the background. Several travelers had already gathered there after being forced off the roads. Families sat around folding tables. A couple of truck drivers shared coffee near a wall map. Everyone looked tired. Everyone looked grateful to be indoors. Ethan greeted the volunteer ranger by name. The man smiled immediately. "Ethan, I was wondering if you would be out helping people tonight." Victoria noticed the familiarity. It was the same pattern she had seen at the community center. People respected Ethan, not because of money, not because of status, because of who he was. The realization continued bothering her in ways she could not fully explain. She had spent years believing success naturally earned admiration. Yet here, in the middle of a storm, a man driving an old pickup seemed richer in something far more important. The ranger handed Ethan 2 cups of coffee. Ethan offered one to Victoria without hesitation. She accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you. You are welcome." They found seats near a window overlooking the parking lot. Outside, the storm continued raging across the mountains. Inside, conversations drifted quietly through the room. Victoria wrapped both hands around the warm cup and watched the rain. Hours earlier, she had been reviewing multi-million-dollar contracts. Now she felt grateful for coffee and a dry chair. Life had a strange way of rearranging priorities. Nearby, a television displayed weather updates. Road closures expanded across the screen. Several routes remained impassable. Emergency crews were advising everyone to stay where they were until morning. A young volunteer entered carrying blankets for new arrivals. Ethan immediately stood to help distribute them. He moved naturally through the room, checking on elderly travelers and helping families find extra chairs. Nobody asked him to do it. Nobody expected it. He simply saw needs and responded. Victoria watched silently. The image stayed with her. Earlier that day, she had reduced him to an old truck and worn boots. Now she was seeing everything she had missed. Quiet strength, grace, kindness, dignity, the qualities that never appeared on financial statements. Several hours passed. The storm showed little sign of weakening. Eventually, Victoria's phone vibrated unexpectedly. One bar of signal had briefly appeared. A flood of messages arrived at once. Emails, missed calls, notifications. She stared at the screen. Under normal circumstances, she would have answered immediately. Instead, she set the phone back down. The decision surprised even her. Across the room, Ethan was speaking with a worried mother whose vehicle had become stranded several miles away. He listened carefully, offered reassurance, helped where he could. Nothing dramatic, just quiet goodness repeated again and again. Later, as the room settled into a calmer silence, Victoria found herself asking a question she had avoided all evening. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan looked up from his coffee. "Sure." She hesitated. "When people judge you, why does it not seem to bother you?" Ethan thought for several seconds before answering. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind them. "It used to." Victoria listened carefully. "What changed?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Lily." The answer was simple, honest, complete. When you become responsible for someone else, you stop spending energy proving yourself to strangers. Victoria lowered her eyes toward her cup. The words landed harder than she expected, because deep down, she knew she had spent years doing exactly that. Proving, competing, chasing approval from people who would never be satisfied. Outside, lightning flashed across the distant hills. Inside, the storm between appearances and reality was finally beginning to clear. Yet neither of them knew that morning would bring one final lesson neither could have anticipated, a lesson waiting quietly beyond the rain and darkness. Morning arrived quietly. The storm that had dominated the mountains throughout the night had finally moved east, leaving behind a landscape washed clean by rain. Sunlight filtered through the clouds and settled across the hills in soft golden bands. From the windows of the ranger station, the world looked calmer, gentler, almost as if the previous night had never happened. Inside, travelers slowly gathered their belongings. Phones regained service. Roads reopened one section at a time. Conversations returned. Life began moving forward again. Victoria Hayes stood near the entrance holding a cup of coffee as she watched Ethan Walker help an elderly couple load supplies into their vehicle. He had been awake before sunrise, helping wherever he could. Not because anyone asked, simply because that was who he was. The observation stayed with her. All night she had watched him do small things that most people overlooked. Offering blankets, carrying boxes, listening when others needed reassurance. None of it would ever appear in a newspaper or annual report. Yet somehow it felt more meaningful than many accomplishments she had spent years chasing. Ethan eventually returned inside and picked up his truck keys. "Looks like the roads are opening." Victoria nodded. "Looks that way." For a brief moment, neither spoke. The silence felt different now. Comfortable, respectful, the kind that appears when two people finally see each other clearly. Several hours later, they arrived back in Cedar Ridge. The storm damage was limited. Fallen branches, minor flooding, a few closed roads. Nothing the town could not handle. As Ethan pulled into the parking lot beside his repair shop, Lily burst through the front door before the truck had fully stopped. She ran straight toward him. Ethan stepped out and hugged her tightly. Victoria watched from the passenger side. The scene lasted only a few seconds. Yet something about it struck her deeply. There was no audience, no performance, no need for approval. Just love, simple and genuine. The kind of thing money could never purchase. Lily eventually noticed Victoria and offered a shy smile. "You are the lady from the meeting." Victoria laughed softly. "I guess I am." Lily glanced at the pickup. "Dad says the truck made another rescue." Ethan shook his head. "That truck is going to get a big ego." For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Victoria laughed without reservation. A real laugh, warm and unguarded. Later that afternoon, a tow service recovered the disabled SUV. Mechanics confirmed what Ethan had suspected during the storm. Water intrusion had caused the failure. Repairs would take time. Victoria listened politely. Then her eyes drifted toward the old pickup parked across the lot. The same truck she had mocked less than 24 hours earlier. The irony was impossible to miss. Before leaving town, she walked back toward Ethan. He was working beneath the hood of another vehicle, sleeves rolled up, completely focused on the task in front of him. When he noticed her approaching, he wiped his hands on a shop towel and smiled. Everything sorted out. Mostly. Victoria hesitated. She was accustomed to presentations, negotiations, and board meetings. Yet these next words somehow felt harder. I was wrong about you. Ethan looked surprised. About me? About the truck? About what I thought it said about you? Wind moved gently through the parking lot. The storm was gone. The mountains stood clear against a bright blue sky. Ethan glanced toward the pickup and smiled. It is just a truck. Victoria shook her head. No, it is more than that. She looked directly at him. It reminded me that appearances tell very small stories. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Ethan nodded. Quiet dignity. No triumph. No need to prove a point. Just understanding. Victoria extended her hand. Ethan shook it. Not as a CEO and a mechanic. Not as strangers from different worlds. Simply as two people who had shared a difficult night and learned something valuable because of it. As she drove away from Cedar Ridge later that day, Victoria found herself looking differently at the people she passed. The old vehicles. The small businesses. The lives she once overlooked. Sometimes the strongest people were the ones nobody noticed. Sometimes the safest shelter arrived in forms the world laughed at. And sometimes the greatest lessons came during storms. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share what part touched your heart most. We would love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe kindness, respect, and second chances still matter, consider joining us again for another story where quiet dignity speaks louder than judgment ever could.